Welcome back everybody, I'm Jiran Khaber, your host, and today I'm going to react to a video called The Censored Deaths That They Never Showed You on Robotech. Now for new updates and content you can visit the links in the description down below, and let's get started. Enjoy.
Robotech.
You remember the Veritex screaming across your TV screen on a Saturday morning. The music, the drama, that feeling that this show was somehow different from everything else. But did you actually know what you were really watching? Robotech wasn't just an animated adventure about transforming jets and alien invasions. It was a carefully edited version of something far darker and more honest about war than any American kids network was willing to show. The Japanese series it came from treated its audience like adults who could handle difficult truths. One episode in particular, the climax of the Macross saga, depicted something so catastrophic that even the sanitized version left a generation of kids stunned. Let's talk about what the show actually was. Saturday morning in the mid-1980s had a certain rhythm to it. You had your cereal bowl balanced somewhere precarious, your cartoon block lined up, and a general understanding that the heroes would mostly be fine by next week. Robotech fit perfectly into that comfortable world, at least on the surface. Giant transforming fighter jets, an alien invasion, a love triangle threading through the chaos. Networks and parents saw a flashy sci-fi adventure aimed at kids who'd grown up loving Star Wars and Star Blazers. It looked like the future of animated action, and for millions of American boys sitting cross-legged on living room floors, it absolutely was. Nobody really stopped to check what was underneath.
Don't worry about a thing, I've got a very good place in mind.
I'm for whatever it is.
The Macross underneath. Here's what was actually underneath. Robotech was built from 3 separate Japanese anime series, stitched together with new dialogue and music for American syndication. The first saga was drawn from the Super Dimension Fortress Macross, a series that never intended to be a children's program the way American networks packaged it. The original Japanese version depicted war with raw, unsettling honesty. Characters didn't just heroically disappear in a flash of light. They bled. They suffered. Entire populations were wiped from the face of the earth, with visual bluntness that treated the audience like adults. Main characters, people you'd spent weeks getting to know, met tragic ends shown with unflinching, lingering weight. This was the show underneath the show you watched on Saturday mornings.
Sounds like the real thing.
You bet it does, Max. Let's go. Hey, Ben, move out.
Don't move, I'll be back real soon.
Harmony Gold's careful edits. So how did all of that darkness get through to American audiences, and yet somehow not fully get through at the same time? Harmony Gold, the company that adapted the series for American audiences, made extensive edits throughout the production. They rescored the music, rewrote dialogue, changed character names, and crucially, trimmed scenes so deaths were implied rather than witnessed. The result was like a photograph with the sharpest edges deliberately blurred. The grief was still there, the loss was still there, but the full, unfiltered impact had been quietly removed before it reached your living room on a Saturday morning. Somewhere in the mid-1980s, someone watched the original Japanese footage and made decisions about what American children could handle. They reached for the editing equipment and started making cuts, softening moments, redirecting focus. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong to be nervous, because what was in that original version was genuinely, profoundly heavy.
We must have. There's no way on earth those things could follow the trail we left.
I wonder.
Skull Squadron, Ben Dixon. If you watched the Macross saga as a kid, you probably remember the Skull Squadron. Rick Hunter, Roy Fokker, and their wingman Ben Dixon. Ben was the big, enthusiastic one who brought comic relief and warmth to the squadron. He was the guy who cracked jokes and seemed happy to be there despite the constant danger. In the American broadcast version, Ben's end came as a sharp, jarring moment. His Veritech exploding in combat, the loss acknowledged by his friends and then carried forward. In the original Macross, Ben Dixon's sacrifice was shown more explicitly and directly than American audiences ever saw. His fighter didn't just vanish in an off-screen implication. The destruction was visible, unambiguous, and immediate, in a way that made you understand a pilot, not just a machine, was gone forever. Ben wasn't a background character you could easily forget. You knew him from multiple episodes. You'd watched him joke around with the other pilots, and struggle with the same fears everyone else had.
I
His
absolutely
loss was
loved
designed to
him.
communicate something specific about war, that it doesn't only take the brooding heroes or the commanders. It takes the funny ones, the enthusiastic ones, the ones you least expect to go. As a kid watching the American version, you absorbed this and kept watching because the show moved forward. As an adult revisiting the original, you realize it was making a deliberate, painful point. War isn't selective about personality type. It doesn't spare the ones who make you laugh. The show knew that truth deeply.
Skull Squadron, emergency!
Skull Squadron, Roy Fokker. Roy Fokker was the definition of cool in a way that landed for kids watching in the 1980s. The ace pilot with the confident swagger, the older brother figure who seemed unshakable, the man Rick Hunter looked up to more than anyone else. When the broadcast version of Robotech showed Roy's passing, it was framed within a combat context and arrived with enough weight to be memorable. It stuck with you in a way cartoon deaths usually didn't. But if you think back, you might remember feeling like something was slightly unresolved about it. In the original Macross, Roy Fokker's death from internal injuries was depicted as more drawn out, more physically consequential, more honest about what those combat wounds actually meant. This wasn't a clean, heroic fade. It was the lingering aftermath of combat damage, a man dealing with something that couldn't be fixed in time. Roy's death in the original version wasn't about spectacle. It was about consequence. The idea that a pilot could survive a dogfight only to not survive what that fight did to his body is a distinctly adult kind of tragedy. The edited version preserved the emotional loss, but softened the brutal honesty of how that loss arrived. Now you understand why Roy's death hit so differently.
I happen to know a way to get us more food than we'll know what to do with.
The authority figures: Global, Claudia, Hayes. Admiral Global was the steady hand throughout the Macross saga, the conscience of the SDF-1 who made impossible decisions and carried the weight of humanity's survival on his shoulders. Claudia Grant was the calm presence in every storm on that bridge, competent and warm and essential to the crew's functioning. Admiral Hayes, Lisa Hayes' father, represented the institutional backbone of humanity's defense and the complicated family dynamics that added emotional depth to Lisa's character. In the American version, these characters were confirmed gone in the chaos of the Zentradi assault. Their absence was acknowledged with appropriate gravity. The grief felt by the surviving characters was real and affecting. But the broadcast version kept a certain narrative distance from their final moments. In the original Macross, the destruction of the SDF-1's bridge during the Zentradi Grand Fleet's assault was shown with considerably less ambiguity. The chaos, the violence of that destruction, the explicit nature of what happened to the people aboard, it left very little to the imagination. These weren't characters who disappeared. They were consumed by the overwhelming violence of a battle that humanity was, in that terrible moment, losing catastrophically. These were the adults, the authority figures. In most American children's television of that era, adults didn't die on screen in any meaningful way. Or if they did, it was distant and symbolic. The original version treated Global and Claudia with a kind of brutal respect, showing that their bravery and competence and decades of experience were not enough to save them when the violence reached a certain scale. War doesn't care about rank or experience or how many people are counting on you. What it meant for a 10-year-old to process losing those characters, the ones who were supposed to keep everyone safe, is worth sitting with for a moment. The unedited version was saying something important, that heroism and sacrifice are real and irreversible, and sometimes don't get clean endings.
Calm down. I have a plan that might help us to get out of this trap.
Blood on the cutting room floor. Beyond any single scene or character death, there was a consistent, systemic choice woven throughout the entire Robotech broadcast that shaped how American audiences experienced the show. Blood was removed from injury scenes. Graphic depictions of what weapons did to human bodies were trimmed or cut entirely. Explosions that clearly depicted pilots perishing inside their cockpits were cut away from at precisely the right moment, redirecting your attention to the destruction of the mecha rather than the human being who had been inside it. If you go back and watch certain episodes with fresh eyes, you might notice how quickly those cuts came, how rarely you actually sat with the aftermath. Throughout the original Macross, the human cost of combat was shown with a regularity and specificity that the American version consistently, methodically softened at every opportunity. These weren't isolated edits made to remove one or two particularly graphic moments. This was a philosophy of revision. The idea that American children could handle the emotional weight of war storytelling, could process grief and loss and sacrifice, but shouldn't have to witness the physical reality that caused those emotions. The cumulative effect of those systematic edits was significant and lasting. You got the grief without the visceral cause. You got the loss without the full weight of what had been lost. The feeling was there, but something was missing that you couldn't quite name. Something about Robotech always felt heavier than it should have for a Saturday morning cartoon. Even half the darkness was enough to make it stick with you for decades.
There finally came a time when we were able to launch a counterattack on the enemy from deep within the ice fields of Saturn.
Dulza's Grand Fleet arrives. You want to talk about the moment that permanently separated Robotech from every other animated series of its era? It's the climax of the Macross saga. Dulza's Grand Fleet, hundreds of thousands of warships, arrives at Earth and begins an assault of incomprehensible scale. They weren't just attacking the SDF-1 or the military forces defending Earth. They were attacking everything. Every city, every continent, every person who had the misfortune of being on the planet when the fleet arrived. In Macross, the devastation of Earth by the Zentradi Grand Fleet was depicted with a visual and emotional scope that was, frankly, unprecedented for animation at the time and remains striking today. Cities vaporized in seconds, entire populations erased without ceremony or dramatic pause. The planet itself was scarred into something barely recognizable, transformed from a blue marble into a wounded, burning world. The original version didn't look away from what it meant for billions of human beings to simply cease to exist. This wasn't a battle with winners and losers and heroes making dramatic last stands. This was an extinction-level event, depicted with the grim seriousness it deserved, asking the audience to comprehend a scale of loss that most fiction, let alone animation, doesn't attempt.
Yes, we should be heading from the cloning chamber.
Lord Rita, we have a transmission from Commander Ozonian.
The darkest moment in children's animation. This is arguably the darkest scene in the history of American children's animation, and most kids didn't even fully realize what they were watching at the time. The broadcast version acknowledged the devastation was happening. It showed the destruction with enough clarity that you understood Earth was being attacked, but it framed the horror through the heroes' reactions, rather than forcing you to sit inside the full, unfiltered scale of what was happening to ordinary people on the ground. The original Macross made you look directly at it without that protective framing. The unedited version was telling a generation of young viewers something profound and uncomfortable. That even with the best technology humanity could develop, even with the bravest pilots flying the most advanced fighters, even with the greatest sacrifice from the people defending Earth, the world could still be almost completely destroyed. Victory, if it came at all, would come at a cost so enormous that winning would barely feel like the right word for what remained afterward. That wasn't a cartoon lesson designed to sell toys and move the plot forward. That was a real lesson about the nature of war and loss and survival.
We've been on this ship for a long time, and I don't know about you, but I think of the SDF-1 as my home now.
Why this show stuck with you. Knowing all of this changes something fundamental about the experience of having grown up with Robotech, and it doesn't diminish the show or your memories of watching it. If anything, it explains why this particular series stuck with people when so many other cartoons from that era faded into vague nostalgia and half-remembered theme songs. Even in its edited form, the original Macross's emotional DNA survived the translation across cultures and broadcast standards intact. The grief was real. The loss was real. The weight was real. American kids absorbed all of that without a full explanation of why it felt the way it did, without understanding that they were watching a filtered version of something even more powerful underneath. The cost of protection. The censorship tells you something specific about the era and what adults in the 1980s believed about young audiences. This was a broadcast landscape that had decided, as a matter of policy, that children needed their darkness filtered, given to them in careful doses, with the sharpest edges removed so nobody got hurt. It wasn't malicious or cynical. It was, in its way, protective, coming from a genuine belief that kids shouldn't have to see certain things before they were ready. But protective choices always have a cost, and what the sanitized version lost was the full argument the original Macross was making. That war is not a backdrop for heroism. It is the destroyer of everything you love. And sometimes billions of people pay the price for conflicts they never asked to be part.
All right, we'll start the operation immediately. Lieutenant Hayes is on the base. Tell her to find the furnace controls and turn them on.
What survived the cuts? What's remarkable is how much survived the editing process anyway. The death still landed. The grief still resonated with audiences who had no idea what had been removed. A generation of American kids sat with a quietly shattered feeling after certain episodes of Robotech without being able to fully articulate why they felt that way or what made this show different from everything else. The answer, it turns out, was always there, just slightly out of frame in the version they didn't show you.
We beat them before and we'll beat them again.
I'm almost certain headquarters must be aware of what's going on.
The full picture. So here's the full picture of what Robotech actually was. It wasn't just an animated adventure that happened to have some sad moments scattered throughout. It was a carefully edited window into a Japanese series that was, at its core, one of the most unflinching war narratives in animation history. Characters you loved met tragic ends that were more brutal and honest than anything you were permitted to fully see on American television. And one episode depicted the near destruction of the entire human race with a scope and weight that animation had simply never attempted before. They tried to protect you from the full version of this story, and whether that was the right call is genuinely worth thinking about. The question I'd love to hear your thoughts on in the comments is whether that protection made Robotech better as a viewing experience, more accessible, more palatable, more appropriate for its audience, or whether it quietly robbed you of something important that you never knew was missing. Because the darkness was always there underneath the surface. You felt it every single time you watched. You just didn't know exactly where it was coming from, or how much more there was in the version you never saw. Which of these moments hit you hardest when you first watched? And how does knowing the full story change how you think about them now?
So that was the censored deaths that they didn't show you on Robotech. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I must confess, the first time that I've ever watched Robotech until a couple of years ago, I think it was 15 years ago, I never noticed that they censored the program. And when I watched the remastered version, I could immediately recognize the uncensored scenes. I mean, at the beginning of Robotech, when we first see Rick enter the air show, him and Roy are talking, and then Roy focuses on Minmay, and then you see he focuses his attention on her backside, you know, and that is another censored scene that is not appropriate for children. I really didn't want Ben to die, but I can understand from Roy's perspective that he had to die, but Ben, come on man, he was such a fantastic character. I really didn't want him to die. And as the narrator said about Dolzer's deaths and his attack on Earth, seriously, that was a really awesome episode, but a frightening episode as well. Nevertheless, Robotech is what it is. Censored or uncensored, it is a brilliant TV series. As I was collecting memorabilia after all these years, I managed to get a copy of the art, and here it is. And as you can see, there are many examples of very good animation designs and so forth. What a fantastic program. And a word of wisdom for today. Parents, always make sure you allow your children to watch programming that is suitable for their age. Have a blessed day further, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.